Where am I? In the village. What do you want? Information. That's part of the intro to one of my favorite shows, The Prisoner, whose last episode originally aired February 1st, 1968. It was a somewhat surreal series about individualism and surveillance with a cryptic main character known only as Number 6. The intro ended with the show's famous line, "I am not a number, I am a free man." It's a well-told story, and 55 years later, its themes hold up well. After all, advertising identifiers are just slightly larger numbers. Which means, this week, we chat with Dr. David Movshovitz from Reveal Security about the information that app logs can give us about security and why behaviors are more than just an average number. In the news segment, a ransom for Riot Games, a refactor that failed, a refactor that flourished, 20 years of Slammer, and more. Enjoy the village, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Imperva is the comprehensive digital security leader on a mission to help organizations protect their data and all paths to it. Only Imperva protects all digital experiences, from business logic to APIs, microservices, the data layer, and from vulnerable legacy environments to cloud-first organizations. With an integrated approach combining network, application, and data security, Imperva protects companies ranging from cloud-native startups to global multinationals with hybrid infrastructure. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. This is episode 227, recorded January 30th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Akira Brand. Hello, Akira.
Good morning, Mike.
Good to have you here. We don't have John, unfortunately. He's a bit under the weather, but hopefully he's listening, and we wish you well, and we'll see you next week. And for everyone else, quick announcement. Thank you for listening to our podcasts. We want to ensure that we are creating the most relevant and useful content for our audience across our network. Please take a few minutes to complete our listener survey so that we can craft our content based on your needs. Visit securityweekly.com/survey to submit your feedback. Dr. Movshovitz is a highly acclaimed Israeli cybersecurity specialist and winner of the prestigious Military Israeli Defense Award for professional excellence in creative thinking. Dr. Movshovitz has served in a variety of senior roles, including co-founder of Algatech Systems, acquired by Kodak, founder of NetAccess, CTO of Magnifier, acquired by F5, and co-founder and CTO of Navajo Systems, acquired by Salesforce. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning.
So the OWASP Top 10 has an entry for security logging and monitoring that largely focuses on logging as a way to detect and understand breaches. But we can't just log data, right? We actually have to do something with it. And I think that's where we have you to help us understand, what does good logging look like and what should we do with it? So maybe let's just start with the first part of that question, perhaps. Like, what does good logging look like, and how do we bring logging into a control or into a process that makes it effective as a security tool?
So I think that a good logging is an audit log that really describe what users are actually doing in the application. Usually there is a trade-off between performance and logging, so you tend to log a minimal amount of information. But then when you have to do some kind of forensics or investigation, and of course monitoring, you are left in the dark. So yes, we don't have to log everything, but definitely every important action performed by a user should be logged. I know that the standard usually is to log only, log in, log out, and things like that. But that's not enough because you are blind to what really is done in your application. So this is related to the first part of your question of what is good logging. Regarding the second part of what we should do about the logging, then today in many cases logs are generated, collected, to a certain degree normalized, and stored in some kind of a log repository or a SIM system, but awaiting that something would happen, and then the forensics team started to dig into these logs, trying to understand what happened, which usually happened quite a lot, after a lot of time after the breach actually occurred, because we all know that breaches, and this is true in general, but especially to application, are detected long after they really happened. And we all know that the damage is correlated to the mean time to detect and response. And as we shorten the mean time to detect, then we decrease the damage. And if we shorten the time significantly, then the damage is reduced significantly.
So, David, you made some really good points that that apply to developers, of course, too. And that's one of the areas I wanted to highlight, is that just saying we need to have good logging so we can have good monitoring means we should also pay attention to what's in those logs. And if we're just paying attention to Mike logged in, Mike logged out, that might help us with credential stuffing or, other types of brute force attacks. But when the breach notification comes and the CEO has to write, "We take your security seriously," then they turn to logs. But hopefully they could actually turn to logs earlier than that, still as maybe not a preventative measure, but finding the precursors to that breach, figuring out, what's happening before that breach. So you mentioned what good logs look like. What can then either AppSec teams or DevOps teams start to do with that information that's in those logs to be basically be more informed than just incident response?
So here is an interesting question. Who is responsible for monitoring the application logs? Now, my view is that the AppSec team or even the Sec DevOps are not the one to really monitor the logs, because they usually more on the left side trying to avoid vulnerabilities, configuring properly the application. The ones who really need to deal with the logs is the SOC team. However, there is a challenge, because the SOC team is not familiar with the application. So there should be some cooperation between the SOC, which receive the logs, store the logs, and should monitor the logs, and the AppSec team, which familiar with the application, so they together can actively monitor the logs to detect ahead of time any signal that can indicate a breach or even a potential breach.
That's a great point, because, especially talking about responsibilities, about who does need to be paying attention to it. And that collaboration stands out to me because you're highlighting the SOC, especially if you have an organization with more than one application, which I think is very common. You have a dozen or 100. The SOC user can't, analysts can't have context about what a user is or isn't doing or should or shouldn't be doing within that app. So there does need to be some logging generated by the DevOps team. But then sort of what we're getting to is, how then do you start to find these security needles in the haystack, so to speak, about this looks suspicious, but we don't want to overwhelm that SOC team?
Of course, neither the SOC team nor the AppSec team. And for that, we need to learn using machine learning the normal behavior or the normal journeys that users, whether they are employees or customers, are doing in the application. Because what we found, and that's a very human, that each of us has its own way of using an application. I always like to give the example of the grocery shop. Each of us has its own route when he picks the products when he's doing shopping in the grocery shop. So if we can learn, of course, automatically, the typical routes of David, then if someone would pretend to be David, or even if David would change his normal behavior due to some reason, maybe good, maybe bad, then we can detect it because we know how David usually behave, and then we say, oh, why you are behaving in a different way? And that is our user journey analytics concept.
And I like that idea of journey because it's not just a discrete point, a discrete action of where we could pick an easy example perhaps of something like the T-Mobile breach where I don't know the details, but ostensibly a single attacker downloaded 30 plus million records. That seems kind of an obvious outlier. But even if we talk about the user journey of Mike versus David versus Akira, there's not necessarily an average thing that each of us is doing. Or, on average, maybe the three of us log into our email at 3 in the afternoon for some reason. But that average doesn't have the same thing as the median or just our individual journeys. So tell us a bit more how the ML helps this, or that idea of anomalous behaviors in finding usefulness out of it.
Okay, so just another example. Think about the fact you have a bank and someone is entering the bank. You want to go to the safe to get the money. Now, there is the employees which has their way of behaving and they may get into the safe. But if I would get to the bank and go to the safe, I would prefer, I assume I won't follow the same route they are doing. And that would enable me to detect that. Now, the ML come because each of us has much more than one typical route. And there is nothing like average route. It doesn't mean anything because, as you said, it's the journey. And the journey, we have several journeys, and as a team, we have maybe many journeys. If we want to detect someone that behaves in a different way than his typical journeys, we need to learn these journeys. How we do it? We create the journeys, and then we want to group together similar journeys. How you can group together similar journeys? Using clustering. And clustering is a machine learning technique. And this is where machine learning help us to learn automatically all the typical journeys for the user, and then to use these typical journeys to detect abnormal journey.
And so that's what's interesting about that is then there's also, of course, we've seen in the security community adversarial attacks against ML systems, just in general. And here I'll run with your banking metaphor a little bit and say, I am planning my heist. I love heist movies, so I've studied quite well. And I'm going to every day adjust my path just a little bit so the average drift does start to take me by the vault. So I don't necessarily stand out. Now, obviously, we're playing with metaphors here. But what does that look like in terms of your, the analysis of the data, what users are doing as slight deviations? Or, and I'm going to actually, let's start with that. Then I'll throw in my other question.
So, if you start changing your behavior slowly, again, it depends what slowly means. But let me give you a real life example that happened to one of our customers. And that was a real fraud done by an employee. When they gave us the data, in that case it was historical data, we realized that this guy basically started changing his behavior. I mean, not every day, but he has some sessions. I mean, most of the time he was behaving normally. But there were some few sessions that were abnormal. And they started several months before the fraud actually took place. When they realized that, they understood that now all he has done in the beginning was in a very small amount of $1 here, $1 there. Mm-hmm. So from all kind of fraud, it doesn't really interesting. However, they do believe if they would detect that upfront and ask him why you are doing that, he wouldn't commit the fraud. Why? Simply because he knows he is being monitored. That's by itself is important. We talk a lot in Appsec about accountability. And we know that you are not allowed to, that one account will be shared by multiple users. Why? Right. Because of accountability. And the same applies here. When you are accountable, when you know that you are monitored and you need to explain, good chances you won't do anything bad because you know you would be caught.
Yes, and tying to that, this is a specific person doing a specific action is just basically a point I want to repeat to emphasize, as well as take to my second part of that question. We are talking about logs that are generated by the applications. Applications, though, are not static. So journeys change because the application changes. And we can either say with our metaphor, they're, pulling up the carpet in our bank. And so they're changing the line, the way people walk through it. Or to be more direct, there's a new workflow within the app, or there's something where all of a sudden, Mike is in an A/B testing, and Mike's journey looks very different from Akira's or David's. But maybe that's because of that feature test, or that's that application. So how do you also identify those areas when it's not just someone probing the boundaries and figuring out if they're being monitoring or what the tripwires are for that monitoring?
So great question. For that, we learn not only Mike typical journeys and Akira typical journeys, but also the entire department typical journeys. So let's assume that today there is an A/B testing. So we would know by looking on the entire journeys performed by the department that we have new journeys, the A journey and the B journey. And then based on that, we can detect that maybe, okay, A journey, B journey, great, no problem. But if I would see a C journey, then that would be suspicion. And usually I would have many A journeys, many B journeys, but a single C journey, and this is anomaly.
So yes, C for crime. That's the journey I'm taking.
I don't thought about it, but nice.
One of the things you also mentioned too, when you're giving us that example about the fraud detection, this was someone who was probing, a couple, looking at the historical data. They were probing. They were trying to figure out, is someone looking at me? What can I do with $1 here, $1 there before, trying to pull off the bigger theft, the bigger fraud. But when you say historical, what does that mean? Because I'm going to guess ML needs at least quality data. Maybe it doesn't need a volume of data, though.
So historically, it depends. If I look for the user, then that's maybe something like half a year to a year. If I talk about department, this may be 2 months, 3 months is enough. So historical is not necessarily so long ago. And of course, you can start collect, and then of course you start learning from this period, from this moment on.
No, indeed. And I think one of the points you made at the very beginning is that a lot of teams, applications, are just generating these logs, but they're going to a dusty area where they're being ignored, not being paid attention to. So it's not like you suddenly need to do something to flip some special field in a log or something before it can be useful for this type of training.
Usually our requirement from the logs are quite basic because, every log has who, when, and what. The only question is that you would log not only log in, log out, but every operation. Now, of course, more data, better detection. But even with limited data, you can perform, because of the context, you can perform quite accurate detection.
One of the things I want to actually expand there from is you pointing out there more details, more fields are obviously helpful. And one of the things that comes from that, or that's perhaps a responsibility of the application developers, so that they can say, or they can understand what additional data needs to be added to there. One question, though, is that we're obviously talking about applications, but you're talking about logs, and lots of workflows, lots of processes actually generate logs. So, how could this also be part of just cloud access patterns or other types of things that are maybe are not quite as obvious when we're talking about just the front end web application?
Of course, once we have log of processes, they can be monitored as well. So you can monitor the presentation layer logs, but you can also monitor the backend logs. And then you would detect that processes have started to behave in a different way, and that may be an indication of a breach going on that someone already has succeeded to penetrate and is doing something bad in the backend.
And one of these things, we want to find out what's bad, what's going on, and we're generating. I think it's safe to say, many applications are generating terabytes of data. A couple of the large organizations may have a petabyte of log data, uncompressed, over a year or something like that. So this is a massive amount of data. We don't want to have a massive amount of alerts now, of course, and think just, well, this looks suspicious, and maybe this looks suspicious. So what are some of the ways we also help that SOC team to not be overwhelmed with just fatigue from all these alerts that come in?
Very good question. And here the accuracy is extremely important. And the fact that you learn not a typical journey or a typical behavior, but many typical journeys help to generate very few alerts. And let me give you an example. We are monitoring 365 usage by a large bank in Europe with 77,000 users and about 60 million events a day. And again, we usually measure it by number of events, not by the storage. And we generate about 60 alerts a month. So it's on an average 2 alerts a day. In other applications like Salesforce, it's even less. It's 2 a week. So the accuracy here, now, it's in addition to the accuracy, we add another part, which is what we call the sensitivity. Because there are anomalies you really don't care about. Why? Because these actions are not meaningful from business perspective. So we enable the enterprise to define what actions, what activities are sensitive. And then they can generate the logs only for these, and we give them sensitivity. So we rank the anomalies based on their sensitivity. And that means that the SOC and the Appsec that should work together can focus on a very small amount of anomalies, just the one who are really interested from business. And last but not least, we mentioned the cooperation that need to be done by the SOC and the Appsec team. And for that, you need to translate the logs from the codes usually that exist in the log to a human readable. And by translating the logs to something that even the SOC analyst, which is not an application expert, can understand, then he now have a common language with the Appsec team and ask them, I have seen this sequence. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and so in that way, is there something that either the log information can do to help with that translation from error 123 or the very domain specific information that comes out of this particular application and the phrasing that it's used versus how you present it to that SOC analyst?
So we enable the enterprise to define his own translation. So in the logs, you usually have codes. Now, you can translate now the code in a way that both the AppSec as well as the SOC would understand what was going on. So I don't have the GUI here, but in our GUI, the SOC analyst or the AppSec analyst can see in a normal language, okay, he export a report with such a lines, with PII data, and then he really understand what's happened. And of course, this is a translation to the codes that exist in the log. So the analyst, as well as the AppSec team, not necessarily has to be familiar with all the details of the app log.
And I think that's highlighting some themes here that just come up during our conversation is who's responsible for which portion of this overall process, from the log generation to storage to curation to consumption and analysis, aka monitoring. One of the things I want to also curious about is, we often talk about within AppSec, within business, we talk about metrics. Is this process working? Is this successful? How do we know it's successful? How do we know we're doing better? You mentioned a few things about, for example, how you track events, and especially turning a few million events into a handful of alerts, quality alerts that aren't false positives. That's one good metric I think that stands out. Another is that we are looking at these are still somewhat reactive. We actually have to look at events that potential attackers or potential malicious insiders have already taken. Are there other ways to think about logging and log analysis from a metrics perspective, just in the sense of we're doing well, or we have effective monitoring or good coverage of monitoring?
So by monitoring the log, generating the journeys, we are measuring, now I'll come back to the average per organization. Okay, how many events have been generated a day? How many journeys? How many new typical journeys have been created? Because you want to know if there is a good reason for learning a new typical journey. And of course, how many anomalies? So by monitoring that, it gives even both the SOC and the AppSec good measurement if things going on well. Because if you would see, for example, on a certain day, a lot of anomalies, something is happening.
Something is happening. That's probably an excellent AppSec motto or something that should go on a t-shirt. We'll have to mention that to John next week. David, one of the things I'm going to switch, this has been an above average conversation. I want to thank you for that. One of the things I'm going to switch to somewhat awkwardly, perhaps, is we always like to ask our guests, describe AppSec in 3 words. Now, we've been talking about logs and security monitoring, but that's not necessarily the only way to look at AppSec. I'm just curious, if we prompt this to you, what is your description of AppSec in 3 words?
So I've been working on one of the first WAFs 20 years ago, the WAF that is become the ASM of F5 after they acquired Magnifier. And I was claiming that application is the most important part in your system because that's what the end user is exposed to. So the infrastructure guys don't necessarily agree with me, but I still believe in that.
No, I think I strongly agree with that one too. And so, I always enjoy, as you got from the intro, I looked back about 55 years for today's intro, but we'll be in the news segment. We'll be looking back about 20 years to SQL Slammer and how that might have looked from a WAF perspective. But we don't necessarily have to look forward 20 years, but is there something to look forward in the next 20 months, perhaps, or the next year that you also want to bring attention to for our listeners?
Yes. So I think that one of the trends we see is the adoption of SaaS for business critical application. And that's mean that enterprise need to start monitoring their SaaS usage. And the SaaS concept today, by enterprise class SaaS vendors, is we give you the logs It's your job to monitor that. And this is a real challenge to CISOs, to SOC, and to the, now I don't know about, here's the Appsec lesson, internal Appsec, because it's not your app, it's your SaaS vendors. But still the SOC and the CISO needs to deal with that and be able to detect abnormal usage. And for that, monitoring the logs is crucial and is going to become even much more important topic in the CISO priority list.
Yeah, it's a wonderful point, because I guess, and that broadens my mind, because I was starting to think about the apps that you as the org are building, and perhaps the environments, like the cloud environments you're building them in, but you can collect logs and do some monitoring for the apps that you haven't built yourself, just as you pointed out, the SaaS that you're consuming. So once again, a wonderful message. I want to thank you again, David, for joining us this week.
Thank you very much for having me and for the very nice conversation we had.
Thank you again. Wonderful. I want to thank Akira and all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.